Good afternoon. I'm Jeswald Salacuse, professor of law at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and I want to welcome you to this session on the roots of terrorism. We have three speakers, as well as a commentator this afternoon. Each speaker, as well as the commentator, will devote a maximum of 20 minutes to their presentation so that at the end we can have questions and discussion with the audience and among the panelists. So we will begin as soon as possible. We will follow the order in the program. Their bios are in your material, so I won't go them in detail. But what I will do is simply introduce them very briefly. Our first speaker will be Hisham Melhem, who is the Washington correspondent of An-Nahar, as well as for Radio Monte Carlo. He will be followed by Micheline, Ishay, who's a professor and director of the International Human Rights Program at the School of International Studies at the University of Denver. Next, our speaker is Peter Bergen, who is the Schwartz Senior Fellow at the New America Foundation, as well as adjunct professor at our sister school, SAIS, School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins. And finally, Feroz Ahmad, who is chairman of the International Relations and Political Science Department of Yeditepe University in Turkey, as well as a visiting professor here in the past at the Fletcher School, will be our commentators. So without further ado, I want to turn the floor over to our first speaker, Hisham Melhem.
Thank you. I have to tell you, we have not coordinated. I don't know what they will say. They don't know what I will say. So I'm a bit confused, but that's why I will start with some broad observations about the business at hand, terrorism, and then say a few words about motives and roots and what's wrong with the American declaration of war on international terrorism. Terrorism is as old as organized human society. The tiny Greek city-state suffered from it, as well as the mighty Roman Empire and every subsequent empire, including this one. There are many definitions of terrorism, but there is an agreement also among experts and practitioners of terrorism, if you will, about a consensus about a definition, workable definition. And it's practically impossible to come up with a definition that would suit George Will and Osama bin Laden and Zarqawi and Abimael Guzman of the Shining Path in Peru. But most people accept certain broad definitions, loose definitions, such as the one proposed by the Defense Department of the United States, which says, quote, the unlawful terrorism is the unlawful or threatened use of force or violence against individuals or property to coerce and intimidate governments or societies, often to achieve political, religious, or ideological objectives. The State Department has a slightly different one. And as Professor Pape said, in the American definition of terrorism, if you attacked military personnel or not on duty, this is an act of terror. Now, obviously, what is lacking in this definition is a simple fact that many people in the world believe, which is terrorism is not only practiced by subgroups or non-state actors, but terrorism is practiced by states too. And one can make many arguments that states do practice terrorism, although I would not go as far as Caleb Carr, who wrote a book that created a great deal of debate in the last 3-4 years, in which he claimed that terrorism should not be used or discussed in political science terms. It should be seen and considered and debated as part of military history. And he believes, in a kind of extreme way, that all acts of violence against civilians throughout history committed by armies do constitute an act of war. Now, obviously, when a state like Israel conducts political assassinations, but of course they give the euphemistic term targeted killings, and end up not killing the person or the targeted individual, end up with killing half of the neighborhood or half of the building where his family and his wife and kids live, that's an act of terror. It's practiced by a state. When the French government, a few years ago, those of you who are old enough and remember, did kill 2 members, active members of the Greenpeace, and given the French tendency to be not very effective in these operations, they were caught. And that was a simple act of state-sponsored terror, conducted by an organ that is part of the state, not by a subcontracted group. Now, obviously, political systems, and in fact, the origin of modern-day terrorism, which goes back to the Robespierre's reign as the reign of terror during the French Revolution, the philosophy of the state was terrorism. Stalin's state was a terrorist state against its own people. Nazi Germany the same, Fascist Italy, the Khmer Rouge, Saddam, you name it. And in wars, among some military historians, revisionist historians, if you will, many people now, or some people now, consider not only the Nazi bombing of London during the Second World War as an act of terror, because the purpose, the objective was to intimidate and to cow the civilian population of London. But also people say that the Allies themselves, when they conducted this strategic bombing, fire bombings of major cities in Germany, like Berlin and Dresden in particular, in which, in some of these bombings, tens of thousands of people perished, that also constitute an act of terror. I'm not going to take a position on this, but that's, again, just to give you an idea and a taste of the debate. Now, obviously, even in the American Civil War, there's a famous incident or infamous incident concerning a famous or infamous general, William Tecumseh Sherman. I love that name. And he was the one, of course, who conducted the famous or infamous march in the South, in which the objective of the march, and this is a war conducted by one American president that I practically worship, Abraham Lincoln, the objective was to break the will of the people of the South. Although not too many acts of violence occurred, a great deal of burning, I mean, this was a great example of modern-day warfare, if you will, where the scorched earth policy was pursued, but in the context of a civil war. I need to drink. I mean, you know what they say about us Arabs? You can take us out of the desert, but you cannot get the desert out of us. As a historically institutionalized system of coercion in modern times, terrorism emerged from the Jacobin terror regime in France in the late 19th century, and at that time led by Robespierre, who claimed that terrorism was, quote-unquote, virtuous. Can you hear me? Now that I'm talking about virtue, you can't hear me? Okay. Virtuous, quote-unquote, and stressed, this is our man Robespierre, terror is nothing else but justice, immediate, unrelenting, and unbending justice. Thus, terror is a manifestation of virtue. Terror is a tactic, as someone said earlier, not an ideology, and that's why you cannot wage a war against a tactic. It's not an ideology because we have left-leaning terrorists, we have right-wing terrorists, we have Christian terrorists, we have Buddhist terrorists, we have Jewish terrorists, we have secular terrorists, you have people who believe in the apocalypse, you have people who believe in utopia, and you have people who believe in 71 virgins. For the life of me, I don't know why 71 but not 75, but anyway, terrorism cannot be eradicated, notwithstanding what George Bush keeps telling us. It's as old as human society, organized human society. To talk about eradicating terrorism is as naive as to talk about eradicating crime in society. The only way you can deal with it, contain it, undermine it, combat it. But don't dream of eliminating it, because there will always be people, men, mostly men, some women, who are willing to use that tool, the tools of terrorism, available to them, while they are engaging in certain political, nationalist struggles, or extremist, nihilistic terrorists, the kinds that Robert Pape did not talk about, whose sometimes apocalyptic, absolutist visions cannot be reconciled, probably in most cases, cannot be reconciled in any rational way, or mediated in any rational way. Terrorism, as history shows, in many times succeeds, and it succeeds in a breathtaking way, unfortunately. 3 examples, quick examples. In Israel, Palestine, the Zionists in the 1940s practiced terror against the British occupation forces and against the Palestinians. Selected, targeted villages in which massacres occurred, and the objective was very clear. to terrorize the Palestinian population, to drive the British out, but also to do ethnic cleansing. They still talk about ethnic cleansing in Israel, but now they call it transfer. Okay. Another example in an Arab African setting, Algeria. The Algerian struggle for independence against the French took the form of classic guerrilla warfare, taking place in the mountains, in cities sometimes, but also at the same time, the Algerians engaged in a campaign of terror that was extremely effective. And somebody mentioned the Battle of Algiers, which is a classic that one should see once in a while. They attacked buses, train stations, cafes, restaurants against French settlers, and that war was successful too. Of course, the other half of the story of the tragedy of Algeria is that they lost 1 million Algerians. Half of them were in acts of Algerian violence, but that's another issue. The most recent example of the stunning success of terrorist acts was the Berlin bombing, the Madrid bombing, in which the objective was very clear: terrorize the people, force the government to withdraw from Iraq. It was a clear, breathtaking success, quick. I mean, tells you something, but the brittle nature sometimes of democratic systems. Motives. Knowing the motives or root causes of terrorism helps in framing the possible political or military strategies to deal with it. Now I have to say something that may sound like a heresy, especially in Washington, although luckily I'm in Boston now, which is to use George Orwell's, paraphrase George Orwell. I'm sorry, I'm losing my, not all terrorists are equal. Remember, not all animals were created equal. Some were equal than others. Not all terrorists are alike. And this is extremely important because it has to do with motives and strategies of dealing with terrorists. And their motives are varied and complex. The motives of Timothy McVeigh, or the anarchist who assassinated President William McKinley, on the one hand, differs from the motives of the Ku Klux Klan, who waged the campaign of terror against the whole American community. The motives of the anarchists of the 19th century Europe, those anarchists who terrorized every capital on the continent from Madrid to Moscow, killing czars, prime ministers, and presidents, are different than the terror that was practiced under the nationalist, ethnic, political umbrellas of the IRA in London, in Ireland and London, FLN in Algeria, PLO in Palestine, the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, and just as these motives are different in many cases from the motives of Al-Qaeda and other groups operating in the name of specific political, nationalist, or ethnic, or are operating in those nationalist or ethnic environments. Now, roots of terrorism in the Middle East and in the Arab world. There are mainly three schools that explains the roots of terrorism in the Arab and the Muslim world, mostly in the Middle East I'm going to focus on. There is one that says, which is somewhat crude and primitive, which was summarized in the words of Samuel Huntington in his article in Foreign Affairs, and not in the book. He took it out from the book, but it was in the article, which is the famous or infamous phrase, Islam has bloody borders. Which in essence says that terrorism is related to Islam, and it's part of the culture, it's innate, it's inherent in Islam, and all that. Another school, it says that terrorism emanates from despotism and repression, autocracy, dictatorship. Therefore, democracy should be the antidote. George Bush, essentially, in his second administration, is saying, essentially, this is our approach to the Middle East, and that's why we are going to spread democracy and in the broader Middle East. The other one, which is explained fully by Robert Pape in his book, and today, terrorism emanates from foreign occupation, denial of nationalist and or ethnic rights, and this is the school that says, essentially, it's the occupation, stupid. Now, there is no doubt that a great deal of the terrorist acts that we have seen and witnessed in the Middle East since the Second World War, in the Middle East and North Africa, since the Second World War, is a response against foreign occupation. This was the case in Egypt when the Muslim Brotherhood emerged in the late 1940s with the British occupation. This was the case in Palestine. This was the case in Algeria. This was the case in Lebanon when the Israelis were occupying South Lebanon. This is the case in Iraq and Afghanistan today. Definitely was the case in Afghanistan under the Soviet Union, more so than it is today. To this list, one could add, as I think Robert Pape would do, the terrorism practiced by the PKK in Turkey, Chechnya, Kashmir, and other places. In all of these cases, terror, in all of these cases, actually, the demarcation lines between resistance, insurgency, and terrorism were blurred. However, under the umbrella of a struggle to achieve independence, self-determination, terror was used against the actual or perceived occupier, as well as those among the indigenous population who were seen as collaborators with the foreign occupiers. Now, there is something else that I'm going to touch on that Robert Pape did not touch on in his book or in his lecture, which is the psychopathological aspects of terrorism. In the anarchical or anarchist terrorism of 19th century Europe, or the terrorism of Al-Qaeda and some of its affiliates today, as well as the terrorism of the Shining Path in Peru and the Aum Shinrikyo in Japan, those who did the sarin bombing or whatever in Tokyo in 1995, it is difficult to see what is the driving motive other than the urge to kill. The poet Wordsworth at one time was discussing one of Shakespeare's plays, and he talked about what he termed the motive hunting of a motiveless malignity. The motive hunting of a motiveless malignity. Even when the anarchists in 19th century Europe, or the 20th century Europe, if you will, talked about revolutionary violence, or when the religiously driven terrorists speak about the apocalypse or cosmic confrontation, it is difficult to see clear ideological motivations of whatever secular or religious nature. Now, there is terrorism that is driven by irrational means, using methods to achieve ends that sometimes are extremely difficult to understand. Mikhail Bakunin, one of the theoreticians of anarchism in the 19th century, in his book Principles of Revolution, preached a gospel of absolute destruction against the state and called for a total break with society and its laws and conventions. If you read, I spent my graduate school studying 19th century Europe and spent many hours enjoying the European novel. I love European novel, although I studied philosophy, and I focused on 19th century Europe. And I came across some wonderful depictions of criminal minds and anarchists who inhabited the novels of Turgenev and Tolstoy and Zola and Camus, if you want to jump to the 20th century. And all of us who read Turgenev remember Bazarov and Arkady. All of us who read Brother Karamazov remember Ilyusha and Ivan. All of us who read, one of the best characters, a terrorist great character, I hate to say this, is the character Souvarine, who inhabited Émile Zola's novel Germinal. It's a great book. Just read it. The first criminal mind in modern day literature was created by a great man named Balzac in Père Goriot. And when we talk about anarchism in 19th century Europe, these anarchists produced some of the best, I wouldn't say best, some good, interesting philosophers who had their own visions of the utopia. They were not only dark visions like Bakunin or Proudhon, but the anarchists dominated the politics and literature and art of 19th century Europe, and their influence went to the 20th century, and we can still see it in the 1960s and 1970s. So this is something that we rarely discuss in this country. Now, I talked about the Japanese, Aum Shinrikyo, I keep botching their names, who believed in theology of destruction. They were the Japanese version of Bakunin, theology of destruction. The Shining Path in Peru blended Maoism with primitive practices and practiced ritual killings. Ritual killings, by the way, is as old as terrorism itself. The assassins of medieval times in Persia and in Syria used to practice ritualistic killing. The idea was to use your dagger and kill the target in broad daylight where practically everybody is watching you. Because the idea is to die. And the assassin was named in Arabic al-Fida'i, the one who sacrifices his life. The idea was to kill, to be seen as committing the act, and to create as much fear as possible. Because you have to spread the word. So ritualistic killing is as old as terrorism. And in fact, if you see some of these ugly videotapes, and because of my business as a journalist, and we get all sorts of, sometimes we see the whole tape of the murder with the ritualistic chanting of Allahu Akbar when the knife is going through the neck. Again, it's a very calculating, I don't want to use the word rational, but it's a very calculating, cold-blooded way of spreading fear. Now, Al-Qaeda's motives, and here I have to disagree a little bit with Robert Pape. Al-Qaeda's motives are varied. I mean, if you read their literature, and so it's sickening to go through it, but it's part of our job. We have to do it, I guess. Somebody has to do it. They are varied and they are complex and they are in flux and they shift. I mean, depending on the mood of Osama and Zarqawi and Zawahiri and the bunch. But at their core, they are absolutist, irrational, and their objectives, if they have any objectives, in many cases are not necessarily realizable. Yes, Osama bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri talk the talk about ending American occupation of the Arabian Peninsula, particularly, and I think one of the questions were correct, particularly Saudi Arabia. Later on, they came up with Iraq added to it, but mostly with Saudi Arabia after 1990, as Robert Pape said. So they talk about the objective of ending American military presence in Saudi Arabia and Iraq now, and other Muslim lands, but they see themselves as waging an existential global jihad against a decadent, corrupt West or a crusader-Zionist axis led by the United States. This is modern-day Manichaeism struggle of cosmic proportion. Bin Laden claims that the United States has, quote, made a clear declaration of war on God, his messenger, and the Muslims. In another occasion, he stated that this war, I'm quoting now, this war is fundamentally religious. Under no circumstances should we forget this enmity between us and the infidels, for the enmity is based on creed. To Osama bin Laden, the United States is a godless, materialistic, decadent, hedonistic society. Hell, he hates the country for all the reasons that brought me here in the first place. One final... This morning I was cursing him when I went to the airport. I swear to God. One final note about the muddle in Washington where I live and the conceptual confusions about the war on terrorism that the President of the United States waged. And somebody's telling me that my time, the boss here is telling me that my time is up. Since we established that not all terrorists are alike, it follows that we cannot and should not deal with Al-Qaeda and other like-minded, messianic, apocalyptic nuts the same way we deal with groups who practice terror, but their grievances are legitimate and they're grounded in nationalistic yearning, in realizable political objectives, or people who are struggling to protect their cultural rights, as is the case, for instance, with the PKK and the Kurds in Turkey and in Iran and Iraq. President Bush speaks often about Islamofascism, but you can forgive the president because he knows very little about history. And when you engage in historical analogies, buddy, you should know your history. This language is not only insulting and inflammatory, and it's not true, and it's ahistorical. But it leads nowhere. It makes a very bad situation much, 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 much worse. And in the same breath, he talks about Al-Qaeda and Zawahiri and Hamas and Hezbollah and other groups and he puts apples and oranges. We all agree, or we all should agree, that blowing up a bus full of civilians in the streets of Dublin, blowing up is an act of terror, pure and simple. I don't care in what name. Blowing up a bus full of civilian people in Beirut or Damascus or Tel Aviv or Haifa is an act of terror, pure and simple. Blowing up a bus in the streets of Grozny in Chechnya is an act of terror. But to reduce the struggle of the people of Dublin, or the struggle of the people of Palestine, or the struggle of the people in Chechnya, or in Kashmir, or in Turkestan, or any other place like this, to reduce all of this, even in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, when one of the greatest men in the 20th century lived, Nelson Mandela, and yes, the ANC did practice some terror. But to reduce all of these struggles, to say we can deal with terrorism through coercive means, and forget that there has to be a political horizon, as we say in our business, we lose sight of the real issue. There is no way you can negotiate a settlement with Al-Qaeda. And if the Americans left Iraq and Saudi Arabia, there will be nuts in that part of the world or everywhere in the world. And we talked about the Shining Path and others, who will commit acts of terror for a variety of reasons. But the point is, Al-Qaeda is not Hamas. Al-Qaeda is not Hezbollah. And there has to be a political approach and a political horizon to deal with these issues. And that's what is lacking in the debate in Washington about this whole issue. I mean, there is no political debate. It's sometimes as divorced from reason as some of the arguments proposed by Al-Qaeda and others. It's absolutist. It's us or them. It's a Manichaean view of the world. And that's what is lacking, and that's why the war on terrorism is going nowhere, because it's not really focused on the real issues. There is no solution. I have no problem with using coercion with Al-Qaeda. And I have to admit, I was ecstatic when I was able to say bye-bye to Taliban. And I would submit to you, the United States had to defend itself after 9/11, whether it is a hegemon or not. The primary responsibility of each government, especially if it is elected, with all our problems here, is to defend the lives of its own civilian population. So I welcome the demise of the Taliban. Of course, we watched it afterwards, but that's another issue. So one could use coercion with people like Al-Qaeda, the Shining Path, or whatever, all of these other fringe groups. But coercion is not going to resolve the Russian problem in Grozny. I mean, what the Russians did to the Chechens is unspeakable. You look at Grozny, you think this is Dresden after the Second World War. What the Israelis have done to the Palestinians is unspeakable. What the Arabs in Iraq did to the Kurds is unspeakable. And we can go on and on and on. But you are not going to end up this by coercive means. Al-Qaeda, even if you're not going to eradicate Al-Qaeda, I have no problem. Or with similar groups like Al-Qaeda, be they the Badr Meinhof or the Red Brigade or the Shining Path and all of the other collections. But terror that is practiced under the umbrella of nationalistic, rational, historical grievances cannot be dealt with the same way you deal with Osama bin Laden or with Al-Qaeda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Melhem. Our next speaker is Professor Micheline Ishay.
Thank you, Leila. Can you hear me? No. Just this way? Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, I see a thumb up over there. Good. I want to thank Leila for inviting me, the President. It's very kind and gracious of you to invite a human rights historian to discuss terrorism. And hopefully I will just discuss that within a different outlook than the gentlemen who preceded me. I have many things I would like to say in response to the speaker who preceded me, but I won't do that because I know that I have only 20 minutes. And I'm nodded yes. So I'm just going to get right into it. And I hope I won't sound initially too inflammatory in my discussions of the roots of Islamic terror. But I'll try, but perhaps toward the end of the talk you will find it perhaps less inflammatory. So I hope you would. The Bush designations of terrorism as Islamofascism, as you mentioned it in your talk, has indeed generated a visceral negative reactions among liberals, and I certainly don't wish to be associated with a public relations campaign to rescue the political misfortunes of our current president. But at the same time, when I'm asked by our host to contemplate the roots of terrorism, it is hard for a student of history like myself not to find striking similarities between radical Islamicism, that is, an ideology which has infused our current understanding of Islamic terror, and the fascist movement that emerged in Europe during the interwar period. Similarities that goes far beyond the use of terror by both. You might not like what I have to say soon, so... During the period of the rise of fascism in Italy, the famous Antonio Gramsci developed a framework for really understanding the ideological, economic, and institutional dynamic that was auspicious for the development of fascism. Not just the external factor, Professor Pape, but those three elements. And so, drawing on the Gramscian model, I'd like to address two questions. And the first question is, what is, A, the most propitious context for the emergence of fascism in its interwar and current form? And the second is, what can we learn from post-World War II policy that headed off fascism resurgence to offer policy guidance for addressing violent Islamicism in our era of globalization? Now, you have to accept the fact that I'm carrying a double burden here because I'm trying to speak seriously about fascism after President Bush has adopted the word, and I'm also trying seriously to speak about Gramsci after Hugo Chavez invoked him in his inaugural address. So that's a hard task, but I will try nonetheless. With respect to the first question, I will argue that both during the interwar period and today, there is a similar synergy among international and domestic forces that created the fertile soil for belligerent, anti-rationalist, and anti-enlightenment ideology. And specifically, those factors include, in your words, Professor Pape, a sense of international humiliation, lagging or stressed economies, fragmented civil societies, vulnerable state structures, and ineffective ideological alternatives. As for the second question, I will argue that countering the appeal of violent Islamicism will require a reapplication, this time to key regions within the global south, of the two linked approaches that uprooted fascism in Europe following the military defeat of Italy and Germany. First was the post-war applications of Keynesian economic prescriptions for Europe that has been disastrously rejected at Versailles following World War I. That is, the regional and international economic integrations that was presented at the time, the equitable economic development, direct ameliorations of suffering through massive economic assistance. The second point of the argument within this question would be that the insistence, which was highlighted by the 1948 Universal Declarations of Human Rights, on implementing a comprehensive vision of rights rather than appeal to security or liberty at the expense of economic and social rights. And I will come back to that. But I realize that having just put together the ideology of radical Islamicism, which has infused current positions of terror today, with fascism, my have created some discontent in the audience. So what I'm going to try initially is to try to show you where I found the similarity. And so here a brief rundown of what a fascist believes. And you tell me, do you expert in the Middle East, if you do not recognize similar sentences and approaches in the works of leaders, Bin Laden, Nasrallah, and others. Now, let me just go for the commonality. The individual must be submitted to an organic community, which is superior to all others. The dominations of that community has been temporarily lost due to some mixtures of humiliating treatment by some historic enemy, and the slavish submissions to foreign dictates by corrupt current leaders. Moreover, many ordinary peoples have forgotten their true identity, seduced instead by the empty lure of modernity, including addiction to consumerism and immorality, leading to a numbing sense of alienations in a vast, decadent urban landscape. And a new leader and his vanguard party or movement now offer returns to past periods of glory and transcendental communal faith, the struggle toward which will be marked by a glorious and cleansing violence. That violence will be directed internally and destroying current order of and contenders for power at pursuing merciless wars against all foreign enemies. Violence, and that's an important part, not just as a tactic, as an intrinsic part of the ideology, for those purposes, including one's own death, is a supremely spiritual and rewarding experience. As men prepare for battle, the primary role of women is to raise as many children as possible, thereby adding to the ranks available for future sacrifices. As Mussolini put it, war is to the man what maternity is to the woman. Democracy is despicable, since it implies that individuals' preference can be allowed to interfere with the higher communal purpose, which is fully comprehended only and only by the leader, or mainly by the leader. While it is a moral obligation to meet the basic needs of ordinary people, socialist appears to the class interests of workers, and the poor represent somehow a divisive attack on the spiritual unity of a society as a whole. But at the same time, the capitalists are perceived as devoted to personal profit, are also driven by crass materialism and unlimited self-interest. Those evil and or other conspiratorial designs are attributable in large measure to Jews, who must be stripped of their enormous powers and perhaps destroyed completely. Other ethnic, religious, and national groups are, of course, similarly implicated, depending where we are. Thus, the movement is neither one of the right nor a movement of the left. As for those who seek compromise between these various factions along the spectrum from the right to the left, they're soft, they're wishy-washy, they seek a viable center, and that is, in the minds of fascists, contemptible and a characteristic of liberal democracy. It is also the ripe of its own destruction. Indeed, those who perceive politics as marked by a struggle between socialism and capitalism, or among the material interests of contending groups, have missed the real struggle, which is between materialism and faith, a struggle in which those with true faith are destined to triumph. Now, this is a short generic summary of fascist ideology, and one, of course, may quibble over which way particularist fascist or violent Islamist movement may deviate from the characteristic I listed, but I believe that one will, as I said at the outset, find great similarity in the work of Khomeini's and others. Now, here's something I wanted to highlight. Over the past century, nearly all society, and I think the gentleman before me said so, have including proponents of belligerent anti-Enlightenment ideologies who have typically remained on the margin of political lives. Wherever you think about, South Colorado, Israel, name it, they are there. But it takes a specific set of socioeconomic characteristics for fascist ideology to take root and inspire mass movement. And I'd like to briefly discuss those factors, first in terms of the rise of fascism after World War I, and then in terms of the rise of Islamic clerical fascists beginning with Iran in the 1970s. Don't know how well I'm doing on time. But, good. Okay, don't look. In terms of...
8 minutes.
Good. All right. In terms of the external factor, which you were insisting upon in your explanations of why jihadists succeed in recruiting soldiers, the most prominent is a sense of grievance against what is seen as unjust international order, not just occupation, combined with the inability or unwillingness of current leaders effectively to redress those grievances. In the case of Italy, it was a sense that its more powerful ally in World War I had failed to provide Italy its share of the spoil of war. For Germany, it was the punitive peace imposed at Versailles. A more general external factor is the transformative power of the advancing world capitalist economy, which imposes a spectrum of shifting pressures and sometimes shock on modernizing societies. Now, of course, different societies respond differently to those pressures. And Antonio Gramsci, seeking to comprehend the rise of Italian fascism, assessed the process of fascism in terms of the strength and the cohesion of civil society vis-à-vis the state. He was concerned with what he called non-hegemonic civil society, by which he meant those in which no social group had achieved ideological or institutional preeminence and where the apparatus of the state was weak, were really more propitious for the development of totalitarian, read, anti-Enlightenment ideology. In the cases of Italy, the monarchy frightened industrialists, capitalists, major landowners, and the church found themselves unable to defeat the radical left. And between those forces, there was a segment of the masses that the historian Eric Hobsbawm has characterized as the little man in society, man crushed between the rock of big business on the one hand and the hard place of the rising mass labor movement on the other. Post-World War II, post-World War I, Germany's civil society was, relatively speaking, in comparison to Italy, slightly stronger than that of other countries in which fascism showed strong appeal, including Spain, Portugal, Greece, Croatia, Hungary, and Romania, and fascist opportunity there rely on a more unique circumstances. For the sake of time, I'm going to move fast to the Arab world. The modern roots of clerical fascism took hold decades later in different regions of the world, yet, like parts of Europe in the 1920s, much of the Muslim world encounters similar factors to those I mentioned in Europe. Deep grievances of externally imposed arrangement, including both humiliations by outside power and a destabilizing encounter with globalizing capitalism. Non-hegemonic civil society and weak state structure, and Caesarea bids for power in the name of a transcendent ideology. In Iran, the associations of the prevailing power structures with humiliating external control was provided by the US-backed coup that installed the Shah in 1953, the last of a series of foreign intervention. The Shah, highly coercive state apparatus, embracing a vision of westernization and secularizations, failed to represent one of the contending groups within civil society, except for a sliver of the extreme wealthy one. But it's in that particular society, in a fragmented society, civil society, that we will see that the broad segment of the population that will become more receptive to the Ayatollah Khomeini's condemnations of modernity and secularization and his vision of an Islamic state. Once the Shah fell in the wake of massive unemployment following the fall of oil prices in the mid-1970s, Khomeini shared his tactical alliance with other opposition groups, and Islamist Revolutionary Committee and Tribunal began murdering thousands of leftist and liberal opponents of the Shah, setting thereby the stage for a gradual consolidation of a clerical fascist state. Now, the situation changed slightly in different regions. Sunni regions of the Middle East and North Africa, similarly in complete modernization projects supported by authoritarian regimes such as in Egypt, Iraq, and Algeria, had also left substantial segments of the population angry and uprooted and stalemated, leaving room for Sunni variants of Islamic fascism. I see something written there. No, not yet. Good. The legacy regimes era had many features in common. All were authoritarian, and whether they were ruled in the name of socialism or private enterprise, all failed to manage modernization in a way that fostered transition toward hegemonic civil society. So it might not just have been occupation. It was just a bit more than occupation. That's what I'm trying to suggest here. And I'm going to just leave for the Q and answer the difference between interwar fascism and current positions of fascism. And in the remaining minutes that were just granted gracefully by the chair on my left, I will talk briefly about the lesson that one can learn from post-1945 Europe to our days. Obviously, our times are grim in our day, and we see relentless jolts of suffering that have been sent through the international system as the potential for world-scale violence and economic calamity hinges on a host of places with sharply divided civil society within fragile or failed state, in states like Iran, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Iraq, Afghanistan, Sudan, Somalia, etc. But let's see, if I were to touch a bit about the lesson of post-war policy in addressing violent Islamicism in our era of globalization, what we will see. Well, let's go back soon after World War II. We see that there were efforts that were enormous to purge Europe of extreme nationalism and fascism, and those efforts were monumental. They include Bretton Woods, they include the establishments of the UN, the UNESCO project, the Universal Declarations of Human Rights, and the Marshall Plans, and they include the creations of democratic and prosperous Germany. And the result was important. It was important because it consolidated strong civil society in Europe, growing prosperity, and also the adoptions of the principle contained in the Universal Declarations of Human Rights. But yet, despite the universality of that United Nations document, the United States and its allies never sought to fashion a global New Deal that would extend to the same principle to what has become today known as the Third World. Instead, all what we know is that the United States assisted nearly anti-Soviet regime, no matter how repressive, and supported insurgency against pro-Soviet regimes, no matter who was leading the fight. In the Cold War final support confrontation, the U.S. extended that principle, of course, to helping bin Laden and his fellow mujahideen. You want me to stop there?
Yeah. Why don't you wrap it up in a minute?
I'll try to wrap it up. Okay. The enterprise is very difficult today for the United States for various reasons. It's because the United States is seen in the Arab world as the country, as the author today of the punitive peace. The Islamist fascism has been nurtured by the sense of the need to redress that successions of humiliation in the end of the United States, the creations of the State of Israel, the installations of the Shah, the support of many of the failed post-colonial repressive regime, and the occupations of Saudi Arabia as well. So what can the United States do? is a question that I would be very happy to discuss in the question and answer part of this talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ishay. Our next speaker is Peter Bergen.
Okay, I'm going to talk quite quickly because we've got 20 minutes. I took the question, what are the roots of terrorism, quite seriously, and I thought it would be most useful to look at the 9/11 attacks. After all, that's the biggest terrorist attack in modern history. We're not concerned about environmental terrorists or vegetarians who might become terrorists. We're really concerned for the purposes of this discussion with Islamist terrorism, which is the biggest threat. Now, it might be useful to actually, let's pretend Osama bin Laden was here. I met him in 97, and he said, this is the reason I'm going to both agree and disagree with Robert Pape here. Here's the reason I'm planning to attack the United States. By the way, do the thought experiment where the Japanese High Command in 1937 started saying, we're going to attack the United States. Imagine how Pearl Harbor might have turned out rather differently. Rarely have our enemies warned us more clearly what they were planning to do, and rarely have they been more explicit about why they were planning to do this. At that time, it was the U.S. presence in Saudi Arabia. Now, that cuts both ways for Robert Pape's argument, because the U.S. presence in Saudi Arabia is down to basically zero, yet al-Qaeda hasn't abandoned its plans to attack the United States. Other parts of bin Laden's justifications for its future attacks on the United States was U.S. policy on Israel, the sanctions then in place on Iraq, et cetera, largely a foreign policy critique of the United States. But dressed up, and in my view, not actually dressed up, but actually bin Laden firmly believes this is a religious war. There was a very good question about bin Laden referring to Saudi Arabia as the land of the two holy places. He never uses the word Saudi Arabia. He hates the Saudis. And, of course, people in his group continue to conduct suicide operations against the Saudi government, who last time I checked are not actually occupying Saudi Arabia. Anyway, so the point is, listen to what bin Laden says. Now, what didn't he say? He didn't talk about Hollywood. He didn't talk about feminism or homosexuality or drugs, etc. So it is not a cultural critique. So let me start with 10, I'm going to do these very quickly, 10 slightly plausible reasons for the 9/11 attacks, and then 10 reasons I think are actually the case. And the first 10 I'm not going to score in any particular order. The first argument is about poverty. This is completely nonsensical. Terrorists throughout history, terrorism has been a largely bourgeois endeavor since it started, whether it was the Russian anarchists, the Baader-Meinhof gang, the Brigati Rossi. Look at the 9/11 attackers. Look at their boss. I mean, he's the son of a billionaire. Look at Ayman al-Zawahiri. He's the son of a very kind of well-known Egyptian family, a surgeon. 9/11 hijackers were a relatively educated bunch of people. One of the things we heard, and it's a related argument, is all about madrasas. Well, madrasa graduates are functional idiots who can read the Quran in a language that they may not understand. They're not a very effective terrorists. To attack the West, you actually have to speak English, surprise, surprise. You actually have to have perhaps a technical degree. And I looked at the 5 worst anti-Western terrorist attacks in recent history and found that of the 79 terrorists, 54% had gone to college. And half of them had gone to Western colleges, and almost none of them had gone to madrasas. None of the 19 hijackers had gone to madrasas. It's about our freedom, so I think we've disposed of that, and bin Laden himself said, if it's about our freedoms, why didn't I attack Sweden? It's about the CIA funding Osama bin Laden. Charles Kogan, I believe, was part of the effort to help the Afghan mujahideen. There is simply no evidence that bin Laden was helped by the CIA. He's a pathologically anti-American individual. He's got a ton of money, both personally and also from the Saudi government. He didn't need the CIA to help him out in his struggle. Also the idea that weak and failing states have got something to do with this. Well, of course, Afghanistan is a failed state, and certainly al-Qaeda took advantage of that. But the 9/11 plot really actually took place in Hamburg. Hamburg is the richest city in Europe, and certainly Germany is not a weak or failing state. Then the argument that Saudi financiers are behind it. Well, the 9/11 Commission looked at that rather carefully, and we still don't know who financed the 9/11 attacks after the biggest criminal investigation in human history. So I don't think there's any evidence for that. Then the argument that somehow the Saudis themselves are responsible. Well, I think this is nonsensical. After all, what is al-Qaeda's main effort? It's to overthrow the House of Saud. They hate the House of Saud even more than they hate the Bush administration. Then there's the argument that it's about the clash of civilizations. Well, this is also nonsensical. The one person who would like that, of course, is Osama bin Laden. But if we were in a clash of civilizations, we wouldn't be in this room because we'd be in World War IV, and we're not. Then there's the argument, I think, the Robert Pape argument, that essentially it's always a response to sort of some form of occupation. And that we've seen this movie before with the Tamil Tigers, who are, after all, somewhat secular. And there's some truth to that, and I think Pape did, his book was a very useful sort of antidote to the view that somehow this is all religious. But The people who are doing these things certainly see that it's purely religious terms. The people who did the 9/11 attacks, when they saw that as an act of worship, look at what the things that they were saying to each other about reenacting the Prophet Muhammad's first days as they killed the passengers in a particular way, slit their throats as if you're enacting the companions of the Prophet. This is not a sort of... And look at the people who actually did the 9/11 attack. Mohammed Atta is an Egyptian. Last time I checked, the United States is not occupying Egypt. Mohammed Jarrah, who is one of the other lead pilots, is a Lebanese. I don't think we're occupying Lebanon or will ever do so. And one of the other pilots came from the UAE. Then there is the argument that we've seen this videotape before, and it's related to what Micheline talked about, and I agree with much of what she said. But the principal exponent of this view is Paul Berman, who wrote a book called Terror and Liberalism. And basically he says, look, this is a bunch of things we've seen before from the 20th century. It's a totalitarian ideology, doesn't like Jews, uses violence, etc. And I think it's a danger to look at this as something which is just sort of a movie we've seen before, because totalitarian ideologies, the first thing they do is they abolish God, because that's an alternate power center. And these people really believe in God. The second thing is, analyzing it as Islamofascism is nonsensical. Fascists, by the way, it's all about nationalism. These people don't recognize nation states. They want an Islamic caliphate from Indonesia to Morocco. So I think this is sort of not a particularly helpful way of looking at things. And finally, there's been the view that this is the death rattle of political Islam. Well-known academics in France like Gilles Kepel and Olivier Roy have said this. Now, with Hamas in charge, in Palestine, and the Muslim Brotherhood doing rather well in Egypt, and etc., this argument doesn't seem to hold much water. So let me get to some of the plausible arguments in ascending order of, I think, plausibility. First of all, radicalization call. And when I go through these 10 points, just think about have any of these things changed since 9/11? Radicalization caused by the Afghan jihad. I mean, a bunch of foreign fighters motivated by religion, bin Laden being the leader of that group, founded al-Qaeda in that crucible. They were not people who were being oppressed by the Soviets. They volunteered from all around the Muslim world to come to this jihad to fight. Secondly, a particular reading of Islamic texts. This may be an un-PC observation and is not a criticism of Islam itself, but the Quran is the word of God. It's not simply a book that just happens to be with a bunch of words in it. And there is plenty of ammunition in there that bin Laden can use to say that this is justifiable. For instance, a verse that goes roughly, when the sacred months are past, kill the infidels. And, bin Laden obviously is doing a selective reading of the Quran, but it is stuff in the Quran. It's not in the Hadith or some other sort of Islamic commentary. Another factor, the decline and stagnation in the Middle East. This is sort of the Bernard-Lewis view, and Bernard-Lewis may have his critics, but the one person who sort of agrees with him is Osama bin Laden. He constantly talks about the humiliation we've been feeling. He talks about the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, which secretly divided up the Middle East between the British and the French. And so this feeling of humiliation, this feeling of decline and stagnation is something to do with this. Then the communications revolution. Bin Laden basically would have been just a Mahdi, the Mahdi in Sudan who rose up against the British in the 19th century. He was one man in one country. It's interesting, I'm not making criticism of Al Jazeera here, but it's interesting that bin Laden declared war against the United States in 1996, at the same year that Al Jazeera came into existence. And that, I'm merely pointing out that the global communications revolution, without that, bin Laden would be a sort of local figure with a local set of local grievances. Authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. I don't think we can, I don't agree with the president on many things, but this is surely one of the reasons. It's not an accident that so many people in al-Qaeda are from Saudi Arabia or from Egypt. If there was more political space for people with Islamist views in these countries, they wouldn't necessarily go to the most radical extremes. The alienation of Muslim immigrants in the West. I mean, as I mentioned, the 9/11 plot really was, the crucible of which was Hamburg. Of course, this is not going away. There was 1 million Muslims living in Europe in World War II. There's something like 20 million living today. Demographic trends indicate that Italians are simply going to go out of business as a group of people in a relatively short amount of time. The only way they're going to survive is by importing a huge amount of labor from the North Africa and Middle East where these things happen. And through a combination of loneliness, homesickness, alienation, and racial discrimination, they're going to be pushed in the direction of these jihadi ideas. We saw in London, we've seen in Madrid, we've seen in Holland and other countries in Europe. The U.S. foreign policy, here's when I'm going to come back and kind of agree with Robert Pape, but the critique of this foreign policy is an exclusively religious critique by the people who are doing these things, and it's deeply held. They're not just dressing it up in religion. For them, there's no distinction between religion and politics. There is no such thing as politics. You can only have a completely religious response in every part of your life. And hence, when interestingly, and I would of course include in that U.S. support for Israel. Now, when I say these things, I'm not saying we should change necessarily an iota of them, but let's be real about what this is about. When Ramzi Youssef bombed the World Trade Center the first time, he gave a very interesting interview to an Arabic woman journalist. She asked him, why did you do this? He said, U.S. support for Israel. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the architect of 9/11, U.S. support for Israel. So, but this is, by the way, coming from a religious critique of the Israeli state. It's not like these guys want to destroy Israel. They don't want to just sort of, they don't want just to roll back the occupation of the West Bank. And finally, 3 other points. And these get to personalities. I mean, I believe in certain people change history. Hitler, it's very hard, to my view, to explain the Holocaust without Hitler to some degree. Obviously, there are a lot of ordinary Germans who went along with it, but Hitler was, I think, a necessary part of that. It's very hard to explain why the French were in Moscow in 1812 without Napoleon. And it's impossible to understand what happened on 9/11 or al-Qaeda itself without reference to bin Laden's personality and worldviews. And so bin Laden, here's the 3 points I would make. One, that bin Laden is a rather skillful technician. He made an incredibly good choice in Mohammed Atta, the Egyptian, as the leader of this organization, because Mohammed Atta performed his task with grim efficiency and was an excellent guy to run this operation. Bin Laden also said, let's not do 10 planes on the west coast and the east coast as Khalid Sheikh Mohammed wanted. Let's make it smaller. Let's make it work. Let's make it too many moving parts. So from a tactical point of view, bin Laden is rather smart. Now, the next 2 points are interrelated. The best analysis of what happened in 9/11 in a lot of ways was Michael Scott Duran's essay in Foreign Affairs entitled Somebody Else's Civil War, which is essentially we're collateral damage in a war for control of the Muslim world. On one hand, people like bin Laden who want Taliban-style theocracies from Indonesia to Morocco, and on the other people who don't want that, which I think is most Muslims. And bin Laden had a strategic analysis which turned out to be incredibly dumb, which was the following. If we attack the far enemy, the United States, that will destabilize our real enemies, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, without the American support. These regimes would not survive. Well, what happened on 9/11, they put this into practice. They attacked the near enemy. But what was the result? Egypt is, I think, Mubarak regime is probably stronger than it's ever been. The Saudis are going to be in power for a very, very long time. And from a strategic point of view, it was a total disaster. And interestingly, the people who most criticized it are al-Qaeda insiders, saying, that was pretty dumb, and we've got this 800-pound gorilla going after us. And of course, the only thing that has kept this movement alive is the Iraq War.
Thank you very much. Our commentator is now Professor Feroz Ahmad.
Well, discussing and commenting on papers such as so complex and so rich in detail and analysis is virtually impossible, and I don't think I'm the person who could possibly overtake it. We have just heard the variety of causes for terrorism are extremely complex. They may include, if not all these factors, most of them religion, ideological, economic and class, political environment, and as Richard Pape pointed out, foreign occupation. All these are listed in our program. And of course, this is extremely wide-ranging. However, I'd like to take perhaps the next 10, 15 minutes to talk about the religious or Islamist factor. And I put this Islamist factor in quote, especially listening to our, Richard Pape, which is seen as the most significant factor in today's world. I mean, no matter how you try to refute it, people still believe that it's Islam and Muslims who are behind all this terrorism. I remember reading a quotation which went something like this. All terrorists are Muslims, though not all Muslims are terrorists. I didn't know what to make of this, but I found it interesting enough to note. Now, I'm a historian, and as a student of history, I've been puzzled by the phenomenon of this Islamic terrorism and its emergence, because you would have expected Islamist terrorism, jihadism, to have emerged sometime in the 19th century, when the Muslim world was under great pressure. And here, when it comes to occupation, parts of it were occupied. But what we find is not terrorism at all, but an attempt to deal with the problem, of occupation through Western ideologies. First, constitutionalism. You find this in the Ottoman Empire with the 1876 constitution. Then comes nationalism, and nationalism and constitutionalism continue right throughout the first half of the 20th century. It's true, the Muslim Brotherhood is founded in 1928, but it doesn't resort to terrorism, and when it does so, in the 1940s, especially after World War II, analysts have said that it's done under the direction of Brigadier Clayton and the British Embassy. One doesn't know the true facts, but this is what people thought at the time. There's another attempt at what one might call Islamic terrorism in 1909, the counter-revolution of 1909 in Istanbul. But that I have demonstrated from British archives was the work of the British intelligence man in Istanbul, a man called Fitzmaurice. So as I just now said, until the middle of the 20th century, the Muslim world looked to the constitutionalism and nationalism in order to meet the challenges of the modern world. The regimes which did this were secular, Nasser, or in Iran, Mossadegh, etc. These were all secular regimes. May I just break off and sip some water? No, I have the water. There is hardly any Islamic response to these secular regimes, although the Muslim Brotherhood opposed Nasser. Now, this is the period of the Cold War that we are discussing, and as late as 1957, January the 1st, President Eisenhower, in a joint session of Congress, calls for U.S. intervention against communism wherever internal subversion or external subversion threatens Middle Eastern regimes. But what I found interesting is what happens on the 4th of November, 1958. On that date, the U.S. National Security Agency, responding to the growing threat of nationalism, notes that the threat to Western interests or U.S. interests in the Middle East, or in fact around the world, is not communism, but nationalism. And in order to meet this threat in the Middle East and the Islamic world, the best antidote to nationalism is Islam. And so you find not the US, but the Saudis. We've been talking about the Saudis as though, they're a tyranny, and they were, but they were under great threat in the 50s. Lots of their pilots used to fly the planes to Nasser, and Nasser besotted with his nationalism. But after this 1958 National Security Agency's directive, you find a great change taking place in Saudi Arabian ideological thinking. First of all, by 1961, they found a new university for the propagation of Wahhabism. A year later, you find an organization which is international in its outreach, called the Rabita ul Alam ul Islam, the Union of the World of Islam. And it's in this period that you find a new definition of Islam. Islam was by and large a sort of fairly rational kind of religion. But here, with Wahhabism, you find it's moving into this sort of rationality. One of the most interesting debates which takes place is in Pakistan. In 1958, General Ayub Khan seized power. In 1960s, he tried to secularize the regime more. And you find a great discussion going on between progressive Muslims and what I will now describe as Wahhabist Muslims. One of the most important members of this progressive group was a professor called Fazlur Rahman. In fact, we may well know him from his books. The man was thrown out of Pakistan because of this kind of pressure, and then he came to teach at Chicago and I think McGill. And in this debate that takes place, he accuses the Wahhabists of worshipping history instead of God. And I think this is one of the best definitions of fundamentalism, the worship of the past, the worship of history, as though the past is written in stone and cannot be changed, whereas we know throughout Islamic history, changes nevertheless took place. Now, in this overall struggle, which I think Washington under Kennedy began to launch, you find the United States overthrowing a number of nationalist regimes, not necessarily Muslim. For instance, Sukarno goes and he is overthrown by the actions of the Sarati Islam, a Muslim organization. In Pakistan, under Ayub Khan, these Muslim movements begin to grow, but the Jamaat-e-Islami becomes very powerful under Bhutto. You have successes like the overthrow of Nkrumah in Ghana, which has nothing whatsoever to do with Islam. And there are other factors. As I said, in 1958 and after, it was an offensive against nationalism. Now, the heyday of this Islamist movement, it continues to grow throughout the 60s and the 70s, comes with the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. We know all this. Jihadism is supposed to be a very important feature of Islam, but if you look at Ottoman history, you do not find any jihad until you reach World War I, and that jihad is made in Germany. You don't find a jihad in the Balkan Wars. You don't find a jihad declared on earlier occasions like the Greek-Ottoman War of 1898, etc. And you can go all the way to the past until you come to early Ottoman history. So that somehow Islam had come to terms with a kind of a secular world. Maybe they saw jihadism, which is a very modern term, as a threat to the rule of the sultans. But anyway, after the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, jihad becomes the order of the day. And this jihad is really, I know just now Professor Bergen dismissed the idea of the madrasa, the madrasa. In fact, that's the first school I went to. I mean, it's just an ordinary school. But in this period, it was completely refashioned. There was a very interesting document produced by Human Rights Watch in 1996. I forget the name of the author, but the author pointed out that the students in this madrasa were all orphans who had been brought up without any female guidance because their mothers and their sisters had been killed, perhaps their fathers too. The mullahs had brought them into these madrasas organized by the ISI, the intelligence company, intelligence organization of Pakistan, and there they were taught a totally misogynist type of Islam. And these are the people then went back to Afghanistan to wage struggle. True, they may not have become suicide bombers who flew aeroplanes, but they became a very important element within the so-called jihad, and they still are, I think. Now, one thing that convinced someone like Osama bin Laden, rather foolishly, was that if we can defeat one superpower, namely the Soviet Union, there's no reason why we should not defeat another superpower like the United States, corrupt, etc., etc. But of course, the big mistake was that these are not the people who defeated the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was defeated by Western arms and ISI guidance. To this day, there are ISI supporters of the Taliban, at least. That's what we are told. And Musharraf has to deal with this. Now, let me simply conclude by suggesting that we are now told that the war against terrorism is going to be gone for generations. May well be true. Therefore, we have plenty of time, but we must make a start. We must make a start to try and deal with what I think is the fundamental problem, and that is the problem of dealing with so-called Wahhabi Islam, which isn't even really a branch of Islam. I mean, you have 4 schools. I suppose they mean Hanbali Islam, but Wahhabi Islam has now become a la mode. And we should try and reverse this process in the madrasas by bringing back what Fazlur Rahman called the worship of God rather than the worship of history and the past. Time up?
No, but you...
But anyway, perhaps we can we can talk about these things over the next, 15, 20 minutes. Thank you very much.
We'll now open the discussion to the floor. Do we have people with microphones? Where? Yes. So, is there someone on this side too?
Yep. She's up there.
Yes. Okay. This gentleman here. Would you all identify yourself, please? And then, if you have a question directed to one of the speakers, please do so, or if it's to the panel as a whole.
Reg McKean of the Harvard Institute for Learning and Retirement. I think all the speakers, not just Professor Ishay specifically, said that they would, or seem to think that the most vital question of all is what should the United States do, and that she promised to deal with this in the Q&A. I hope other panelists might comment on this point, this most important point of all. The panelists clearly have many disagreements as to causes. I wonder if the panelists would show more unity on the what do we do now question.
Thank you. Would the panel like to address that? What should the United States do? And I think all members of the panel, perhaps.
The reason why I went back to the interwar periods and the post-World War II was to actually examine what were the solutions that were developed at that time. The problem with the Bush administration, it has actually opposed the very principle that was adopted after World War II, which was Keynesian economic policies that coincided with an understanding of inalienable and indivisible positions of human rights. What the Bush administration did is by saying its first envoy in Iraq is Bremer was to just privatize the economy right there and not thinking how you build a society which will actually and how you would build and strengthen the civil societies and outbid Islamicist roots that actually have gained popularity in the very social services that that actually show their strengths, not just in Iraq, but in many other countries. So I think that in that respect, we see that that's one of the big problems, or myopia, if you prefer, of the Bush administration. And that's the reason why I thought bringing back several decades of visions and where that visions went was interesting. Of course, one should remember that the Keynesian visions and even the Marshall Plan visions was confined to Europe only. And that was the problem. There was nobody talked about economic development, democracy, and social welfare beyond the European continent. And that's certainly an unfinished labor, and I hope that the minds that are in these rooms will take the baton and pursue that project.
A global New Deal.
Global New Deal.
Other members, Mr. Bergen?
Yeah, I mean, okay, I take that question to mean what should we do in Iraq, what should we do in Afghanistan as the most immediate problems, and what should we do in Iraq? A total withdrawal from Iraq would be to snatch a total catastrophe from the jaws of enormous blunder, and there's 2 reasons for that. One, what is the strategy of the jihadists? Their strategy is to get a state in the Middle East, or part of a state. It's laid out in Ayman al-Zawahiri's Knights Under the Banner of the Prophet. The last thing we need to do to these guys is give them a mini Afghanistan in a country that has the second largest oil reserves in the world, that is not far from Israel and is in the heart of the Middle East. So the question is, do we get an F or a D- in Iraq? The D- option is to define down what our national interests are and forget about, this is a very, I'm afraid, unpleasant observation, but we have no ability to make Iraq a democracy and we have no ability to stop the civil war. We should forget about these things. What we do have an ability to do is manage our national interests in the way that we should have done in the first place, which is who's going to attack us, where might they do that from, who is really the threat. And of course, we've introduced the threat in the very place we said the threat was supposed to exist in the first place, but now it's there. What should we do in Afghanistan? In Afghanistan, we can do a surge. Somebody rather wittily said about the Iraq surge, it was really more like an ooze, which I thought was a good... in Afghanistan, we can do a surge. After all, this is where al-Qaeda comes from. This is where we were attacked from. And the window of opportunity there is closing rather rapidly. If you look at the situation in Afghanistan today, it is not dissimilar to Iraq in the summer of 2003. A real insurgency. Suicide attacks have now gone from 21 a year in 2005 to 139 this year. Exponentially rising IED attacks, etc., etc. On the positive side, 8 out of 10 Afghans think the American and U.S. military presence and the international troop presence there is a good thing. They are happy about the Taliban being gone, 80% of Afghans. And so we have an opportunity. And we could actually do something militarily there. 3,000 or 4,000 extra U.S. folks on the ground in Afghanistan would make a difference. $10 or $20 billion would make a huge difference. And I agree with Micheline in the sense that Marshall Plans, if they're done in the right way, can work. I'll give you an example, one that spectacularly did not work, that we've been doing in Egypt since 1979. We have transferred tens of billions of dollars to the country that incubated the jihadist groups that became al-Qaeda, and it had no effect. So the reason, the way we do these Marshall Plans has to be done in the right manner. And then finally, the big question, what should we do with the war on terrorism? And, my advice is a sort of Hippocratic oath. First, do no harm. We're the 800-pound gorilla. Every action we do may well provoke some very counterproductive reactions. Since this is a generational thing, I do believe that to be the case, and certainly our enemies do think we're not going to be in Iraq necessarily forever, and so we do need to come up with strategies that address this. But our ability to actually influence what this is all about, which is a debate within the Muslim world about how to construct their societies, is something that we have very little ability to actually get involved in, except in a very negative way, in my view.
I agree with Peter's views on Afghanistan, but on Iraq, I also agree that whether we believed initially that this was George Bush's war or even America's war, now it's everybody's inheritance, including the Arabs. Now, there's a great deal of complaint in the Arab and the Muslim world about the American blunders in Iraq, and I don't know at this stage whether one could say that the Iraqis can be saved from the nihilism of some of their leaders or from the blunders of America. But I really don't think that anybody who's interested in stability in the region, and as someone who hailed from that part of the world, who's interested in the future of that part of the world, and of course in the interest of American national security interests and economic interests and cultural interests, we cannot allow Iraq to descend to hell. Today we have civil strife. I know this is an academic debate among historians and analysts, whether we have a full-fledged civil war or a civil strife. Essentially 100 to 125 people are dying. If the Americans leave precipitously, and by precipitously I mean next 3 months or 6 months or even a year, you will have 500 people dying, and you will have ethnic cleansing on a massive scale, and you will have a Shia-Sunni bloodletting not only in Iraq, but in other countries where you have these two communities living uneasily with each other. Just take a look at my country of birth, Lebanon. So this is an extremely dangerous issue, and there is very little seriousness in the Arab world, not only in Washington, about the stakes, and the stakes are historic, and Robert Pape is correct. This is worse than Vietnam. And Peter is absolutely correct. We cannot afford it. And so those who complain have to think seriously. This is a classic trap, but for America to leave is not an option. Just leaving, precipitous withdrawal is not an option. Osama will win. The mullahs in Iran will win. You will have not only a terrorist state, you probably have disintegration. And these things, judging by my own experience in my own country of birth, Lebanon, abnormal conditions can remain and stay for a long time. If somebody told you in the late 70s that there would be a war between Iran and Iraq that would last for 8 years, in which tankers will be blown up, in which cities will be blown up, in which missiles will be launched against population centers, in which gas will be used, you would say nonsense. Okay? And people live with these things. And look at Angola, look at Mozambique. This situation in Iraq is going to last for a long time. Peter is correct. We are not going to put an end to the civil war. There is a naive view in the Middle East that the Americans caused all of this. Yes, the Americans took the lid off of a huge mess that was beneath that lid that Saddam Hussein, with his brutal regime, kept it under wrap for a certain period of time. It's just what Tito did in Yugoslavia. These are ancient enmities. There is a great deal of tension between them. And I don't want to exaggerate this whole thing, but Iraq, until this moment, is still a project of a nation. And you scratch many Iraqis, including people who speak 2, 3, 4 languages. And they can be sophisticated as they come. You scratch them a little bit, and then the Shia comes up, and the Sunni comes up, and the Kurds comes up, and the Turkmen comes up. So it's a big, huge problem for us. We're stuck there, and we should be tough with both the Shia extremists and the Sunni extremists. I mean, I don't want to quote George Bush, but there is a truth in what he was saying the other day. And we should not lean towards one group or another. And Iran is a country on the ascendancy. There is a view in Iran and in Syria among Hezbollah and Hamas that this is a generational confrontation. We are on the ascendancy. The Americans are in a state of retreat. And there is a regional confrontation. It starts from Baghdad to Al-Anbar, to the public squares of Beirut, to the narrow alleyways of Gaza. And if you don't look at it that way, in that kind of panoramic regional way, you are missing the point. Now the Americans made huge, historic, incredible blunders. And it's sad to see the United States, sometimes government, acts like a third world country in which there is no such thing named as accountability, in which the CIA failed miserably and then we give George Tenet a Medal of Freedom, in which Rumsfeld should be put on trial probably for his dereliction of duty. You know, and not what we can do now is essentially try to be forceful with the Iraqi government, with those who are trying to drag Iraq into civil war, to be tough with the Iranians. This business of engaging Iran at this stage and thinking that engaging Iran is a panacea is nonsense. Is nonsense. Just as the principle of engagement is important, the environment under which you engage is important, the timing under which you engage is important. The other day, Condoleezza Rice said something very interesting about the Cold War. We engaged the Soviet Union in the Cold War. There was a red line, and we could talk to them. We signed agreements with them, but we were undermining them, and we were challenging them, and we were helping the dissidents. So there are ways of dealing with Iran and with Syria and with others. And whether we like it or not, there are people in the Middle East who are yearning for freedom, and I'm not going to preach George Bush's gospel here, but the United States cannot back down now and leave these people in the lurch. Whether they are in Egypt, the United States should be forceful with Egypt and with all Arab autocratic regimes, because the stakes are very high in Iraq, and it is still possible to have an outcome in Iraq that will not be democratic Iraq. This is nonsense. This is not Germany after the Second World War. This is not Japan after the Second World War. You know, that's the problem with historical analogies. People who live in Washington think that history began 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. In Germany, the neighborhood wanted us to succeed. In Japan, the neighborhood wanted us to succeed. There was an industrial base. There was highly educated people, skilled people. That's why rebuilding was possible. And these societies were homogeneic societies in Germany and Japan. In Iraq, that's not the case. And finally, in Germany and Japan, we had all of these countries had one common enemy called the Soviet Union. The neighborhood around Iraq doesn't want the United States to succeed. The conditions in Iraq are different. So it's extreme. Let's start a serious talk about what the stakes are in Iraq. And that could lead to a possible outcome. I mean, there is no rosy scenario in Iraq. Every outcome is going to be bad, you know. But just leaving Iraq now is the worst outcome possible.
Professor Farr.
Well, I'd like to go back to the suggestion that the United States abandon its Cold War agenda to snuff out nationalism. I heard Secretary of State Albright, Brzezinski admit that this was a game they had to play in order to defeat the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union has been defeated. But then the neoconservative agenda that too has to be abandoned. I mean, you know, all this talk of democracy, one really should engage with all the countries in the region instead of denouncing some as rogue states, etc. You know, as people have said, we dealt with the Soviet Union. That was a rogue state of the time. But nevertheless, well, that's how, Nixon denounced it? Not Nixon, Reagan denounced it. And so now perhaps it's time to open a new chapter, and perhaps it will open after 2 years if the Democrats come to power and you have a new regime. But yes, this is going to take time, but I think one of the first things that the United States and the West has to do is to change the kind of Islam that the United States and Saudi Arabia put into operation. And I think this is very important for Saudi Arabia, and I believe it's already being done to some extent, but it's probably a slow process.
Questions?
My name is Ibrahim Dager, and I'm with the World Lebanese Cultural Union. I would like to address Hisham and just to express to you and to Rami Khouri, whom I thought I spotted here earlier, and
he was somewhere in the back.
Okay, and Professor Fawaz Girgis is scheduled to speak tomorrow, to express my respect and gratitude for the clarity of vision you all have towards events in the Middle East, especially in Lebanon. Also for the courage with which you express these views. And my question is regarding Hezbollah, which has for many, many years stated that they would limit their struggle against the Israelis in South Lebanon, and now have turned clearly inward. Not only to participate, but with this campaign now to topple the government, basically, going on for a couple of months, and turning very ugly as of Tuesday this week, and unfortunately today, the total of 7 killed now and many injured, burning cars, intimidating people, etc. Question is, do you think these practices amount to terrorism? And secondly, what in your assessment is or are Hezbollah's vision and the plans for Lebanon?
For some time now, I've been saying in English and in Arabic that Hezbollah is a state within a state. And Hezbollah happens to be led by a very strong, charismatic man. They know what they want. They have the means to do it. They are willing to endure pain, and they are willing to inflict pain, very much like Iran. They are Lebanese. They are not Iranians, obviously. When they were fighting the Israelis in South Lebanon, they were not terrorists. I mean, the irony was that the project of liberating South Lebanon from the Israelis was a nationalist project. I supported it. I'm not a Mahatma Gandhi here. At the same, the irony was that the instrument of liberating Lebanon was essentially a sectarian instrument. And Hezbollah in Lebanon is a sectarian group. It's called Hizbullah, which means, in contradistinction to Hizb al-Shaitan, the party of the devil. I'm not a Muslim, therefore I'm part of the devil, I guess. Devil's party, which is fun, actually. But Hezbollah is the strongest military power in Lebanon, the strongest political organization. Again, one of the ironies is it is led by a man who has a turban, who's a religious figure, is a leader of a militia, essentially, and is a political leader. And the other day he was criticized by the LBC television in a sketch, and he had riots in the streets because you cannot touch him. He's untouchable. He's a man who wears a turban. I'm not saying they are doing essentially Iran's bidding, but there's a very complex relationship with Iran. It's not a relationship in which the Iranians can tell Hezbollah what to do. It's not like it's a faucet, they turn it on and off. It's more complex than that. Hezbollah is a partner to Iran. It may be a junior partner, but it's not a stooge. And that's why one has to understand the dynamic relationship with them. Iran gave Hezbollah probably 20,000 missiles. Many of them are primitive 1950 kind of missiles, not because they love Hezbollah or because they love the Lebanese. Because those missiles will be used when and if the Israelis or the Americans attack Iran's nuclear facilities. And we've seen what happened in the South. That's the problem with the United States. If there is an American military option against Iran, the first thing the Iranians will do is to retaliate against Iraq and kill American soldiers because of their connections with the Shia groups in Iraq. But they will do the same thing on the Israel-Lebanese border. So, and Hezbollah, and one of the ironies when Hezbollah, we talk about Hezbollah and Syria is a country of 20 million people, relies on Hezbollah, which is essentially a non-state actor, to maintain the little that was left of Syria's regional influence in the region. And they are using Hezbollah. And we have a weak leadership in Syria that looks up to Hezbollah. When Hafiz al-Assad was around, they always kept him at arm's length. Hafiz al-Assad had a very healthy disrespect for organized religious groups. and that's how we dealt with them. Hezbollah today, Nasrallah made a major misreading of the strategic equation when he launched this war, essentially, or triggered the conflict in the summer. The Israelis fell with this incredible stupidity, fell into this trap, destroyed the country. They did not destroy Hezbollah. But anyway, you ended up with Resolution 1701, which tied Hezbollah's hands in the south. Now you have 12,000 foreigners, foreign troops in the south, 15,000 Lebanese in the south. Hezbollah cannot move its missiles and its formations as freely as possible. He's stuck in the south. That's why he turned his attention to Beirut, to bring down the government, so that 1701 will not be implemented in a very robust way, so that there will be no international tribunal, and then Hezbollah will maintain what's left of its state within a state. And this will please the Syrians and the Iranians. That's what Hezbollah is doing. The riots took place 2 days before the Paris donor conference in Paris, obviously. And this is where we are. And Hezbollah took the Shia community hostage, in my opinion, and took the whole country hostage.
Any other panelists want to comment on that question or that issue? If not, gentlemen in the back. Yes.
Hi, I'm Stephen Nathanson. I teach philosophy at Northeastern University. I guess I have two comments. One, with respect to what the United States should do in the war in Iraq. People have described a lot of really dreadful things that may happen if the United States leaves Iraq, although Professor Pape's analysis perhaps doesn't support that fully. But I don't think that there's any reason to believe at this point that the United States can do anything good in Iraq. So in spite of those worries and concerns, I'm not sure there's a case for us remaining or playing the kind of role that we're playing now. Another point about the more related to the conference as a whole and the idea of terrorism. In my own thinking, I think it's important to define terrorism as essentially the heart of it is attacks on civilians as one particular tactic. And in fact, although the panel was extremely interesting on roots of various kinds of conflict, nothing really was said about terrorism specifically, that tactic. And I think that's a good thing, and that we actually, in order to both advance our academic understanding and hope for better politics, I think we ought to get rid of the word terrorism or use it only in that very narrow sense. Almost nothing that has gone on in the last years has to do with terrorism. It has to do with a variety of political, religious, cultural, economic conflicts, and so on. And I think that we should strive to articulate these things in ways that don't play into the hands of people who just want to inflame these conflicts.
Professor Ishay, you have a comment?
Yes, it's true. The reason why I didn't start with the definitions of the word terrorist is precisely because any group which attempted to advance an agenda that might be beneficial for the common good might be terroristic because the mean that that group uses is unacceptable. You were before suggesting that Robespierre was an apologist of terror. Actually, having read Robespierre, I would like to add that when he talked about terror, he talked about the temporary state that was necessary in order to evict the enemy of Republican France. He never talked about it as an end in and of itself. I'm also recalled by someone else later on, and you'll see where my point goes, was when Leon Trotsky had written a pamphlet called Their Morals and Ours. And in that book he said, you cannot conflate the violence that is used for a slave to unchain himself with the violence that is used in order to put him in chains. So the whole debate about terrorism is always that conflation between means and ends. Or rather, we only focus on the means and not so much on the ends. The reason why I was talking about Islamicism and fascism is because I was concerned not about the means any longer, but what are the ends that people are willing to use, and is it justifiable? Are those ends justifiable in and of themselves? So I spent quite a great deal of time to discuss about sort of the hatred for enlightenment and democracy and progress and things of that sort, and then connected violence with those ends. We don't do that often, and that's the reason why the definitions of terrorism is problematized.
This side. Yes. The third row down. Yes, that gentleman there.
My name is Saeed Kouri. I'm an American citizen of Lebanese origin. I am a Christian Maronite. So it is an answer to both Hisham, Melhem, and the other person here that talked about Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a Shiite group. When the Christian and the Sunnis dominated politics in Lebanon, 75 cents of a dollar was spent on Christian areas and Sunni areas, and 25 cents was spent on Shia areas, and only to Shiite groups there that supported the Christian Maronites. We all knew in Lebanon, and we now know more than enough, that Hezbollah and the Shiites basically are the majority in Lebanon. Yet they are treated as the number 3 power in our sectarian division. My only question is, if there is a democracy, why cannot Hezbollah has as many groups, as much people in the government as the Christian minority or the Sunni minority? Thank you.
Do you want to give a brief answer to that?
Okay. Look, I used to refer to the Shia in Lebanon as the invisible community because they were marginalized by the Lebanese political system. You're right. I don't think they are a majority. I think they are a plurality. But this is neither here nor there. I also agree with you that the real cancer in Lebanese body politics is sectarianism. But this is not going to be gotten rid of anytime soon. I don't care if my problem with Hezbollah is the fact that they are an armed group, armed community essentially, and you cannot have a discussion across the table with representative of the other communities if your gun is literally on the table. So it's a question of their current status as a militant armed group, having what they refer to as quote-unquote strategic relationship with countries like Iran and Syria. That is what is problematic. Not I'm secularist. I don't care who's the president of Lebanon. I think that system should be changed radically. And if the president is a Shia and the prime minister is a Kurd or Armenian, I don't give a hoot. That's not the issue. The issue is, what are they doing right now? What do they represent? Their history that they were marginalized? Absolutely. They will always be marginalized. And they have been marginalized in Iraq when they are a majority, clearly. They are marginalized in Bahrain where they are a majority. And they are marginalized in the Gulf states where they are a minority, obviously. But it's not going to be resolved by military means.
We have time for one more question. This gentleman here. Is there a microphone? Yes.
James Williamson again. First of all, just clarification, Professor Ahmad, when you talked about the memorandum, I believe you were referring to a National Security Council memorandum, not a National Security Agency.
All right.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
They're the NSA, they're the ones who spy on us, and the NSC, they're the ones who direct us. Now, my question really grows out of something that Mr. Melhem, you said, when you talked about Algiers. Iqbal Ahmad, who many of you I think will be familiar with, a recent collection of his writings, he was involved in the making of the Battle of Algiers as a consultant, and there's a text in that collection where it's taken from a discussion with one of his classes, I believe at Hampshire College, and he talks about the Battle of Algiers, that moment in the Algerian Revolution, which engaged in forms of what are called terrorist attacks on the French colonial presence, as a complete catastrophe, and as a very significant failure that led to the destruction not only of the revolutionary movement in Algiers, but in turn, he argues, led to the form that the eventual victory took and has shaped it to this day in a way that does not reflect the popular democratic will of the people of Algeria. And so my question is, and since we're talking about terrorism, can we maybe begin to open up some of the conversation about these kinds of issues as reflected in particular in the situation in Algeria?
Let's try to, I would ask the panelists to give a brief answer to that because we're going over time. And I'm sure subsequent sessions will be treating that same question.
You want to take it? No, look, I mean, quickly. My point was terror sometimes succeeds. And I did not reduce the Algerian struggle into terror, obviously, because there was a classic guerrilla movement. Now, the fact that Algeria did not turn out to be a shining democracy, I'm not surprised. And there are many reasons for that. Chiefly among them is 130 years of French colonialism that really devastated, pulverized the country, culturally, politically, you name it. I mean, these people did not even speak Arabic. They had to import teachers from Egypt and Lebanon to teach them their own language. I mean, this is unique. So, but my point was that terror succeeds, and I use that as an example.
Mr. Bergen? Professor Ishay?
No, it's
okay.
His question.
No. Final comments. Thank you very much. It's been a very interesting, a very complex and intelligent.